This interview is on behalf of the Preach Book Club for Preach magazine. Here we focus on A Preacher's Tale, written by Jon Russell, a book all about narrative preaching. This is our interview with the author. Jon is a parish priest in Northumberland and has taught narrative preaching for 10 years in the Diocese of Newcastle and Durham. Hello, Jon.
Hi.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
So you've been teaching narrative preaching for about 10 years now, and your book, A Preacher's Tale, was published this year in March 2018. You must have reached a point where you've explored and you've experimented with many sermons, and you've got to a point now where you think that you have some useful techniques to then pass on to your readers. Do you think that's right?
Yeah. Narrative preaching is there really not so much to explain what the text means. When I was taught to preach, the preacher's job was to know more about the text than the people who'd be hearing the sermon, and to find a way of passing on that information and illustrating it so as to get them to respond in some way or to help them to learn more. But narrative preaching, one teacher I listened to said, when people hear you preach, they don't want to be given a map to show them how to get to the coast so much as to be drenched in the spray. And that phrase has always stuck with me. I think what it means is that when you're preaching in a narrative way, what you're trying to do is enable people to have an experience rather than to advance an argument or elucidate a series of points. And I think that's the big difference.
So let's go back to the beginning, and when you first came across narrative preaching, what did you think initially of it?
Well, I got to the stage in my ministry where I'd been trying to preach in the way I'd been taught for about 10 or 15 years, and got to the stage where I just really couldn't do that any longer. But I was very lucky. I was asked to help organise a conference on preaching, and the main speaker was an American teacher from the Washington College of Preachers called David Schlafer, and he showed and demonstrated this way of preaching, and it completely blew my mind. This had such an immediate effect on the listeners, this way of delivering a sermon, that I've tried to do that in the various different forms that it takes ever since. So it was a life-changing thing, really. That was 20 years ago now, and that's what I've been doing since then.
Fantastic.
So after 20 years of doing it, the thought and the chance to write and pass on a little bit of what I've learned through experience was too good to miss, really.
Fantastic. So you've taken it on, and how has it affected your own preaching then, and the responses that you've had in your many congregations?
Well, people do like you to tell stories. Jesus himself tells stories, of course. Whenever a documentary is made about some esoteric scientific point, they don't start from the basics of physics. They start with the story of some maverick physicist who eventually persuades the rest of his discipline that his idea is correct. So there is a drama and a plot there which makes whatever point is the makers are trying to make, but does so in a dynamic way rather than setting out a series of points. It's like being invited into a butterfly house to see the butterflies, rather than being taken to somebody's study and seeing them all pinned to a board.
It's a very good
You're
point.
seeing the same things, but they're alive rather than dead.
Yeah, brilliant. So turning to the book itself then, you step into different characters and you extrapolate their backstories, their thoughts and their words, starting with God himself in chapter 1. What might you say to somebody who, on more theological grounds, does not want to stray from the actual words of the original scripture?
Well, I think that's a good point, but the scripture as we have it is already a translation from the languages in which it was written down. So there's already a degree of interpretation involved in that. What I tried to do in the way I've put words onto the lips of and thoughts into the minds of the characters is really to interpret what I'm reading in the scripture there, and not to introduce new ideas, but to to make those ideas speak to the moment, to use a modern idiom, if you like, to try and get beyond the fact that this was all written down at least 2,000 years ago.
Yes.
So I hope that I'm not misrepresenting God or Jesus or anybody in what I've said, but simply applying them to the story as it's being told
In the modern day.
In the modern day, and yeah.
So would you agree then that Jesus might have been the best storyteller there ever has been? Is that quite a claim that you...
That is a big claim to make.
Big one.
But he certainly knew how to use a story. For instance, when he's asked about neighbourliness, he doesn't derive a doctrine of neighbourliness from his understanding of God or give us the three main points about neighbourliness. He says, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves. And 2,000 years later, the Good Samaritan has passed into our language, and we still tell that story today. So I think that shows that he clearly understood the power of stories, not so much to tell people what to think as to invite them to think in a particular way and to explore for themselves the truth that he was trying to get across to them. So I think that's why he uses story and uses it as well as he does.
So how do you think then narrative preaching compares to Jesus' own storytelling? Are there any differences or similarities that you...
Well, his are a lot briefer. Many of the parables in the Bible are very short. You've got a bit more time to explore in a sermon, because even a short sermon of 10 minutes or so gives you much more room than a single parable. So you can look at the backstory of the characters. You can use the stories from today that they inform and weave the two together in a way that I hope enables God to get through to people. That's what it's all for.
And then turning again to the book itself, then each chapter includes a real sermon that you yourself has preached. Is there a favourite sermon that you have that you've put into the book? Could you explain why?
Quite a lot of them are favourites, actually. I love the first one with God sort of sitting on his veranda sipping his gin and tonic after all that creating, but then having to find Adam and Eve and ask them why they've disobeyed him and what the implications of that are. I found Sarah Laughs a very moving sermon to write, because as soon as you begin to imagine what life might have been like for her, it becomes a very poignant story, and so many other stories meshed into that from her day right into the present. So that was a powerful one to write. The story of Great Gable Remembrance I find poignant because I know Great Gable very well. I've climbed it many, many times, and I always pause at the war memorial plaque that's affixed to the top. But developing that sermon, knowing the backstory of some of the members of the Fell on Rock Climbing Club that installed it, was powerful. And I love the final one as well, which is really an idea pinched from Justine Gardner of a gallop back to Bethlehem, to be there in time for Jesus' birth, and galloping back through history and meeting all the characters who wrote our scriptures along the way. Was really very exciting. So that was another of my favourites. And I think the reason they are favourites is because they all have plot and movement, so that you can see that they're going somewhere rather than being static, looking at the butterflies pinned to somebody's display that I mentioned earlier.
I suppose they're a lot more accessible then, just in terms of having the structure, this narrative flow and direction.
Yes, they have a tension. The listener doesn't necessarily know quite where they're going, and they pull you in and invite you to think your way through the different characters that occur, and see how that applies to your own story as well. So they're quite fun to write as well as everything else.
I'm sure they are. So you described the book as not a homiletics textbook in that way. Could you explain how it works instead and how it works for the reader?
Well, I'm not a professional theologian. I'm not teaching theology in a university faculty somewhere. I'm just a parish priest who has to preach a sermon every Sunday. What I tried to do was to pick examples of sermons that illustrated or linked back to the stuff that real homileticians have done, to make their work accessible, because a lot of this work on narrative preaching has been done in America and hasn't really crossed the pond. And yet I think it offers a way of making sermons engaging and exciting that we haven't yet fully grasped in this country. So that's what I was trying to do. But I hope people might read it almost as bedtime reading, rather, something that engages your emotions rather than turns on your analytical brain. So I hope that they might themselves be drenched in the spray that I mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. And I suppose in terms of bedtime story, not only appealing to adults but also to children, I suppose.
Yes. The truth is we all like stories. Sometimes the discussion of learning styles in some of the books, and different people learn in different ways. I would contend that preaching is not about expecting people to learn, it's about expecting them to experience something. And so story is a tremendous way of doing that.
Absolutely. So the book came out in March this year, and it's had some very good responses so far. What have been your most favourites so far in what you've received?
Well, it's been encouraging to hear people's reactions. Those who've read it, some have said it moved them to tears in places. That's, I think, a good thing. The reviews that I've read so far have been good. Sales seem to be holding up well. Been no interest in the film rights, I'm afraid. I was thinking George Clooney, you know.
Potentially. He's having his heyday, absolutely. Yeah. I understand that it came out at a particularly difficult time for where we are living at the moment, March.
We had The Beast from the East, didn't we? Which meant I was waiting for copies of the book in order to sell them to students on our ordination training course up here. And there were no deliveries in the village for a week. Further up the valley, supplies were having to be helicoptered in, so it was touch and go whether they arrived, but fortunately they did.
It did.
And fortunately the students were good enough to buy a few copies as well.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, I think that's all we have time for, John. Thank you very much for speaking to Preach Magazine, and all the very best with your book.
Thank you very much indeed.